All right, here we are recording. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. I have a very special guest today. It is none other than Richard Nell, who is the author of a book I recently read and enjoyed thoroughly. If you haven't seen the review yet, you'll well, go watch it because you'll see how much I enjoyed Kings of Paradise. It is the first book in his trilogy of Ash and Sand. And Richard Nell has been kind enough to agree to come here today and speak to me about Kings of Paradise, but we're also going to talk about self-publishing and a few other topics before we get into Kings of Paradise. We'll have a little bit of a non-spoiler discussion of Kings of Paradise once we get there, and then we'll get into some spoilers. But no spoilers for the rest of the series, which I have not read yet, but I will be reading soon. So welcome, Richard. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks very much for having me, Mr. Chase, or sorry, should I say Professor?
Oh, you can call me Philip. On BookTube,
Okay.
I am Philip. Some people, I have all kinds of names now. I can't keep track of all of them. One of them might be the Hey Jerk or whatever, but I'll answer to Philip. That's good for me.
Excellent.
So anyway, yeah. So I think it would be great, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people who are active on BookTube, whether they be viewers or creators of channels, are probably, there's a little piece of them, maybe at least, that is thinking about being a writer. So I'm sure there are a lot of aspiring writers who are listening right now to us. And I'm sure that a lot of the creators on BookTube actually are writers on the side as well. So a lot of interest in writing. And of course, the industry has changed a lot in the last couple decades. And one of the biggest, I think, most interesting things happening is the whole self-publishing world and what's going on there and what resources are available to self-published authors. What that journey of self-publishing has changed a lot, I think, in the last couple of decades from what it once was. There was this sort of stereotype of vanity press and all of that sort of thing. That was more than a couple of decades ago, probably, actually. Very outdated perception, if anyone still has it. But I'm very curious, actually, myself too, to hear about what you have learned. I mean, obviously, you have successfully self-published a trilogy, a fantasy trilogy, and it is getting some great reviews from some really respected reviewers in the BookTube community, certainly, and I'm sure in other places as well. Patrick Leo has been a real champion for your trilogy, and so lots of other great stuff coming out. So that's exciting, but I wonder if you could just start us from the beginning a little bit about how you got to where you are now. Share your wisdom with us.
Yes, well, as limited as that may be. So I came in, when did I start? 2014 is technically when I quit my job to start this ridiculous journey.
Yeah.
And I didn't know anything. That was the baseline. So I wasn't coming from some insider scoop, here's how I'm going to make my millions. Nothing like that. I knew I always wanted to do this. And I just thought, well, I know it's a thing. I sort of knew that people were doing this, and I knew that there was a market. Yeah. I didn't know how to get successful versus not successful. I didn't know the difference between that, really, other than as a writer, you want to write a good book. But so that's what I set out to do. I didn't worry about the marketing side. I'm not sure that's the right choice. I'm not sure that's the right way to go into this, just for you listening. I went in very much as I'm going to write a good book, and then I'm going to figure out the marketing afterwards.
Okay.
So I sat down. Yeah, it took 2-3 years to write what is now Kings of Paradise. But
First book.
Yes. Yeah. But that is sort of not quite fair to say, because there was a lot of learning happening in there. There was a lot of drafts. There's a lot of me sort of teaching myself what I was doing, and I would talk to other writers and I would submit writing to them. So to make this long part of it shorter, I'll just say you have to be able to write a good book.
Yeah.
If you don't believe in your own work, if you don't believe in what you're doing, it's not going to happen, I don't think. And probably as a reader, I don't want it to happen.
Right.
The first piece.
I think that's great advice, actually. I mean, there has to be some real passion to really push you to do this, because it's not easy, and it's not going to pay you a lot, especially in the beginning, right?
Yes, it's sort of like, think of it as starting a business, if you want to think of it that way. It's going to take a great deal of work. and and there's just no way around that. Yes, you're going to hear the occasional story of someone who wrote their first book and sold it to, or got an agent and sold it to a publisher, and everything, you know, the stars aligned. Those are the stories you tend to hear about because it's sort of survivor's bias. You know, you hear,
Right.
but you didn't hear about the 900,000 guys that didn't make it and that didn't happen. And the most usual story is sort of, and I like to use this is an actual musician, not a writer, but Michael Bublé. I don't know if you've probably heard of him. Somebody asked him, you know, oh, your overnight success story, basically, what happened? And he said, well, it took 10 years. You know, so overnight success stories are not really a reality. Okay,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
so now that we've dispensed with that, so the marketing piece, there's a lot to learn, and I didn't know any of it.
Right.
And I really, when I put the book out, it was to crickets. It was nobody read it, nobody bought it,
Right.
and I didn't expect anything any different, to be perfectly honest.
Right.
And so my process was to really try and get reviews, because I understood that before you could do the advertising piece, you had to actually have some reviews on Amazon and Goodreads. Otherwise, people aren't going to give you the time of day. They need a bit of social proof.
Right. Right.
So any way you can get that social proof, by all means. If you can get a contest to say your number one, you know, book and whatever, or you can get another writer to say, hey, I read this book and this was decent. But my strategy was to get reviews from bloggers and reviewers, things like that. And it wasn't until a reviewer by the name of Esme Weatherwax is her let's say Twitter or her handle.
Yes.
I'm not sure if she has her real name out there or not, so I won't give it away.
Right.
Gave me a chance, basically, and this is a person who's now a SPIFBO or a self-published fantasy blog off judge.
Yeah.
And she had a bit of a platform. She read the book and she loved it, and then she pushed it on some other reviewers who said, hey, read this book. And that is really how I went from 0 to 1. It's how I went from nothing to actually, this person liked the book.
Yeah.
Maybe you will too.
So that was your first handhold, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Wow. And so she pulled me up out of the darkness, basically, and got me into more of the blogger world. That's how I started to network a little bit, because I didn't know who these people even were. I didn't know who to follow. I didn't any of that. Then I started to meet some writers who were also maybe part of this. So between her and I also entered into this SPIFBO contest, which is Mark Lawrence created.
Yes. Yeah, that's fantastic. That's just a great thing that he's, and I'm sure other people have contributed to the organizing of it. And I think he's brought some light to some really great books in that way. So yeah.
Well, and I was a big fan of his before that.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of his too. Yeah. And
so I knew who he was, and that's how I knew about his website and sort of found that. But I also entered into some contests. One of them is the oh good Lord, the Independent Fantasy Award, IRDA. I'm not sure what the R stands for. And I ended up not even realizing that I'd won it. And somebody, it's one of these things that you do trying to build up publicity and momentum, and then you don't think about it because, you rarely ever win such things.
Right.
And then somebody sends me this message saying something along the lines of, will you be attending the gathering in Sacramento or whatever it was? And I said, no, why would I, basically? And they said, because what? And I thought, oh, isn't that interesting? And I looked.
Well, in that case, maybe I'll come.
Well, I ended up not attending, and they had to mail me this thing, and it was all. But it was sort of too late, by the time I found out. But maybe I feel a little bit bad about that. And then I ended up winning something else, gold in some reader's review. So I should probably stick those stickers on the book at this point.
Yes, you should. Yeah.
But I had enough social proof at the time that I thought it wasn't that big a deal, and I'd already had the momentum going, and I don't know. So there's another thing you can do: enter contests.
Yes.
Some of them are free. Some of them charge money. So it depends on what some of them are scams, and you've got to figure out or very nearly scams.
Yeah.
Let's put it that way. And that is a big problem in this industry,
Yeah.
not just with contests, but with reviewers as well.
Oh
Not
yeah.
everybody is doing this purely for the passion. And a guy like you is a gold mine. You know, you want to find guys like you who are just doing this for the passion, who care about their readers, who are trying to get books to the right readers and to objectively review, because there are lots of people out there who just say, hey, give me $50 and I'll review your book.
So you're saying basically that networking is really, really important for a self-published author,
Yes.
not just to get the word out, but also just to know what's legit and what's not, because you talk to other authors who might help you with that sort of information. So I guess that's so important. Social media, I think you and I both are not naturally inclined towards social media. So it's yeah.
You can say it. We're old. You can say it.
Okay. I was teasing you in an email about your flip phone, which you had mentioned in your interview with Steve. I had a flip phone too, by the way, not so long ago, and my students made fun of me when they saw it and called it a grandpa phone. So, yeah.
I mean, what can you say to that? Other than, you know, I tell people the world has changed so quickly. This is maybe a divergent, but my mother, who's passed away now, but she told me a story when she was a little girl. She didn't have electricity. So imagine the world has gone from one generation. Of course, electricity had been invented, but she lived in a farm in a small town, and they didn't have.
Yeah.
So you've gone from that to we have space junk. You know what I mean? I mean, we've got so much crap in space that it's a problem.
Yeah.
So it's just trying to wrap your brain around that is a difficult thing to do. Yeah. And to pull that back to the self-publishing industry.
Yeah.
Same sort of insane change is happening. We're going from these huge companies that had sort of the monopoly, not quite the monopoly, but we talk about the big six, let's say, which is now, by the way, sort of the big 4 or 5.
Four now.
Yes. Well, I mean, even in the 4 or 5 years that I've been doing this, we've lost one of the big publishers, or they've been bought up by another publisher, I think. So yes, there are huge changes in the industry. So no matter what I tell you today about how you do this in the self-published industry, it may not be valid in 5 years, 10 years. And so you really have to be ready to adapt to whatever the changes are.
Yep.
You have to think of this in terms of sort of a business, even though I hate it. I hate all of this. I just want to write my books in my basement. I want to swing an axe at anybody who bugs me. You know, just get out of here. I want to go back to my scrolling in the dark. Yep. But you can't do it. You have to learn the business side. And I would say, and I would in fact say that the most successful model, if that's what you're truly going for, is good writers who are great marketers. Yeah. It's not great writers who are okay marketers. So you can not like that, and I don't, but that is the reality. So I would prefer it if you were a great writer and a great marketer. I would prefer it if you rose to the top because you deserve to in the writing. And over time, that may very well be the case. You know, if you're a great writer and an okay marketer, 20 years from now, you might be on the top. But you're going to watch the guys who are great marketers get there much faster. Yeah.
Wow. Well, that's how, and you have to be savvy about that. I mean, even if you're a very good writer, but you have zero willingness to engage in marketing your work, you can count up your friends and your family, divide it in half, and that's about how many books you're going to sell. So sad to say.
Yeah, so, unless you are tremendously lucky.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, we could talk about writing to the market, and if you write the right book and you write the right, that's all very important, of course, and there's things you can do that way. But again, if you want to produce great art, it depends what you're trying to do. If you're trying to produce great art, don't give a shit what anybody wants.
Yeah.
Don't give a shit what anybody thinks is going to sell.
Right.
Do what you're passionate about and write that.
Yeah.
And you're never going to get George Martin, George Lucas. It's funny how many Georges you've got. You're never going to be at the very top of the game if you don't do that. but there's not very many people who can do that.
Right.
That's a short field of people who are going to be in that category. So if
Yeah.
you just want to make a living writing fiction, then you love it, and then you do have to worry about writing the genre, and you have to worry about brand, and you have to worry about all that stuff.
Right.
And by all means, start today.
Yeah. Yeah. I think even for it's changed so much that even writers who have been published through the traditional publishing industry have to do much more social media stuff and be much more savvy in terms of self-marketing than
Yeah.
ever used to be. The idea of the writer locked away in the ivory tower is long gone. So even
Well,
even for the ones who have managed to get into the traditional publishing industry.
yes. Well, and I'm curious, like from your perspective, what do you see? Like, who are the most visible writers that are doing this well, or what interests you in terms of the marketing aspect?
Yeah, so I mean, if you go on Twitter, you'll see that certain writers are active on Twitter, right? And I follow the ones that I like, so those are the ones I tend to see the most. But
Right. So you
I,
like the writer first, then you follow sort of second.
that's how I am. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's how I tend to be, and I'm not the most comfortable person on Twitter either. So
Only a madman would be.
yes, true. And I think you need to be very careful on about what you tweet and stuff too. Be very careful because that's blown up in a couple writers' faces as well, in a big way. So
Yes.
uh,
That's maybe another topic, but it's funny. You'd think writers, we for a living, essentially, we say what we think, right? I mean,
right.
you'd think that would be the case, but actually I've come to the conclusion, keep it to your fiction.
Yeah, yeah. I
If you
think that's wise. Yeah,
Yes, if you have something you're very passionate about, if you want to say something, put some goblins and dragons in it, and
yeah.
explore the topic,
Yep.
but don't go out on Twitter and say this is what I believe and this is what I think. And for the most part, I think good writers cannot be ideologues anyways.
Right.
So if I see a writer who is clearly very opinionated politically or ideologically, I tend to think, I suspect your writing maybe not something I would enjoy that much anyways.
Yeah, the last thing you want to do as a writer really is to preach to your audience. That's
Yes.
not going to be a very compelling book, is it? So speaking of
No.
that, also, I was curious about, so there's the whole marketing side we've been talking about. In terms of your craft, you've obviously worked hard on it. And do you have any tips as far as that goes? And any, like, did you read textbooks on how to take courses, or do you just read what inspires you and try to do what they're doing? What's been your approach to working on your craft?
Yeah, well, it's funny because I just, even by your face there, right, when you're thinking, do you read textbook? There's almost an attitude that might be something that a writer might look down on. I don't at all, and I think if you are interested in writing, you should. This is maybe true of anyone in the entire world. You should never look down on things.
Yeah,
If people are really interested in something, whether it's writing textbooks or whatever it is, assume that they know something that you don't.
right.
Assume that you don't know everything, because I assure you that you don't. So yes, read writing textbooks, read good ones, read bad ones, read everything. Read every genre
Yeah.
that you can conceive of. Read erotica with Yeti porn. I don't care. Read mystery stories. Read the old classics. Read Beowulf and
Yeah.
Dante, and that. So that there's no question that that's what you can do. And if you should be doing that your whole life, more or less. The second you think I might want to be a writer for a living, start reading all of the greats,
Yeah.
and then move into the modern stuff, and that will always serve you well, even if you don't understand it. You might get there eventually, and then you need to start writing at some point. Start writing, and of course earlier the better, but you're going to be crap, and that's fine. The sort of, there's a myth of the great genius that sort of sits down at his typewriter and pumps out the next American novel. Doesn't really happen. There's always a long story before that. These
Yeah.
people have put in the time. Sure, maybe there's the occasional Isaac Newton of fiction, I don't know who that is, and you're not that, and I'm not that, so don't worry about it.
Nope. Yeah. So that's great advice. So read a lot and read not just within your genre, but all over the place. In your case, I know you read a lot of history, and that's probably informed your fiction a lot as well and made it richer, I'm sure. And the other thing is be humble and realize that your first efforts are not going to be great and that you're going to need to work on that craft and revise, revise, revise. And if you can, yes, I mean, it's nice if your mother likes your writing. That's great. Probably she will.
Mine didn't.
Oh. Oh dear. Well, that's interesting. But so whoever you can get to read your stuff and get hopefully some critical. And if your mother's like that, great. That's fantastic. So get people to just kick you all over the place because that's how you get better. So if somebody's, you don't even always have to. So I think sometimes when somebody critiques your writing, they may propose a solution that doesn't exactly make sense. But the fact that they put their finger on something that might be wrong there is something for you, the writer, to look at.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. I think it was Neil Gaiman who said this, and I always quote him, that when someone tells you that there's something wrong,
Yes.
they're almost always right. But when they tell you how to fix it, they're almost always wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and he's a great writer too. By the way, you asked about writers who are social media savvy. He's definitely one of them.
Yes, I noticed that. Yeah.
Yeah, he's pretty active, not just on Twitter, but also I've seen that he has a lot of videos on YouTube and in other places. So that guy's done a really good job he's a great writer too, of course. I think this is an example of a great writer who's also a great marketer. So
yes. Yeah, there are a few. Well, he's sort of has an almost celebrity personality. He's a great public speaker. I've seen him sit in front of rock concerts or live music and read pieces of his book. So there's people who can do that stuff, and if you can do that, make use of every bit of talent you've got. Right?
Yeah.
If you're great at pithy little comments on Twitter, do that. If you can write essays and about fantasy, post them on Reddit, or find where you can employ your own talents, but you don't generally want to be forcing it. In my,
Right.
I tried that a little bit, and I just found it so inauthentic, and I hated it. And you think, why am I even doing this? If I want to hate what I'm doing, I can go work in insurance. So yeah, there's an element of that for sure.
Yeah, I do believe that because it is so much work, and because the financial rewards are not usually tremendous, especially in the beginning, you have to really be passionate about it.
Yes.
Well,
and I want to go back just quickly to, we were talking about the craft side, and
yes,
I'd be remiss if I said, okay, you can write all you want, but there's two things that I really found useful for me. One is finish what you're writing.
Yeah.
It's fine if you've got 15 projects, but you actually have to finish things. Right. And once you finish them, you actually have to show them to people.
Yeah, I think that's great advice.
You have to do that. And I don't care if it's your friend or your teacher, your professor, do that. And what you should do, it'd be really great if at some point you could get it into the hands of another writer.
Right.
Writers tend to be very generous in this respect. If you approach writers, even reasonably successful ones or famous ones, and you say, if you're very polite and you're very humble and you're, say, hi, I have done this thing, it's in your field, you got to know the writer first. Would you be willing to look at this?
Yeah.
Don't send it to them, ask them first, and once they say yes, maybe they'll look at 5 pages or something.
Right.
See if they'll give you a quick critique. Sometimes there's libraries, they'll have writers in residence.
Yeah.
That's the thing you can do. And I did that in my local city. I got very lucky in that there was a fantasy writer at the library.
Wow. Good for you. Wow.
Yes. And so I went and approached him, and he treated me very politely. He wrote for children, and I gave him something. Well, the very first scene of my book is
oh, yeah.
So he's a children's writer, and I'm giving him this sort of very adult themed stuff. But he was very professional. He said, okay. His only comment was on a scene that was quite a nasty scene was, do you have to take it that far?
Okay. Huh.
Anyway, I thought that was funny, but he had great things to say about style and about, so writers, they won't give you, you don't have to take everything that they say
Right.
as gospel or perfect or anything else, but usually they'll have something useful to tell you.
Yeah. Yeah. I've found some of the best feedback I've ever gotten is not that specific. It tends to be more maybe, you could work on your relationships between your characters because those relationships tell the reader how to feel about the character, or it's just very broad general advice. Do you find that to be the most helpful rather than fix this comma?
Oh yeah. Well, everything has a possibility of being useful. So you have to kind of examine it
Yeah.
and reflect. But yes, you can waste your time going down rabbit holes where
Right.
often people will just have their own specific interests.
Right.
This person might hate this type of character, or he might love this type of story. And so he'll say, why don't you do something that's more like that? Because I like it.
Yeah.
And that's, again, it's kind of useful. But if you've got people in your life who can be quite objective and quite honest, great,
Right.
good for you. Go to that person and get their advice. If you don't, just go to strangers. Go to 50 strangers. And again, you have to realize that they'll have their own personal foibles and their own interests, and they might not tell you the truth or something that's useful.
Right.
But if you amalgamate the advice and you hear 10 times you should do XYZ, they're probably onto something.
Yeah.
And as I say, and as you said earlier, just stay humble. You've got to develop a thick skin.
Yeah.
And sort of like the Rudyard Kipling poem, you got to make room for their doubting. But you've got to believe in yourself at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's quite a trick, really.
Yes.
Be humble, but believe in yourself. So, yeah, that's some mind acrobatics right there. So, but that's what you have to do. I agree, and it's a good idea, I think, if you can join a workshop with other writers, like you said, or get involved a little bit on the types of social media where other writers are hanging out and get to know them.
Wherever you can find them.
Okay.
I happen to live in a pretty small place.
Yeah.
So the literary scene where I live is non-existent, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you live in a bigger city, then by all means go to the sort of physical workshops and find writers wherever you can. Yeah. I had to find them online, basically.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Now, have you ever thought, or did you ever think about in the beginning, you just went straight to self-publishing, or did you think about trying the traditional publishing route?
I basically considered it briefly and then didn't. I never have queried in my life. I've never sent an email to an agent.
Okay.
Partially that's personal, stubborn obstinacy. I just don't like asking for permission. As I said, I could see that there was a market. So if I see that there's a watering hole, why would I ask someone to drink? I thought I'm just going to do it, and nobody's going to stop me as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
So I've sort of said this before, but I think there's no harm in querying. There's no reason not to go the traditional route.
Right.
But I would suggest that at the same time, you should probably think about the self-publishing route as well.
Yeah.
And the industry has changed. I mean, it was always a little bit like this. I mean, who are the biggest sellers of books easily? Celebrities, right? I mean, so the market was always a little bit that the publishers would really like it if you already had a platform.
Exactly.
If you can already prove that you're going to sell books, then you're really making a business case as much as you're making an artistic case when you're going to the traditional publishers.
Yep.
And I think that's more and more true these days, because they just don't have time or the money. They're a bit of a industry in crisis. They can't afford to take chances as they maybe once did.
Right.
So they want you to be a sure bet. And if you have your own platform, look, I've got 100,000 Twitter followers. I'm Daniel Green. He's maybe a good example.
Yeah. Although he self-published, though.
I know he did, but I'm saying if you're Daniel Green,
you
go to a traditional publisher and you can say, look, I'm a license to print money.
Right.
Why don't you help me print money?
Yeah.
And they will say, we would love to help you print money. here, please, please sign on the dotted line.
Yeah.
So there's a good example of someone who built up a platform,
Right.
and then translated that into book sales. And I
Right.
suspect he'll be shopping, around for a traditionally published deal, but I don't know that for sure.
I actually wondered in his case, because you said, I don't know what his subscriber count is. I think it's like 300,000 or something, which is very respectable. And he's worked hard to build that community. So that's great for him. And maybe he figures I can make more money self-publishing rather than having, because what is it? He'll make a fraction of each book sale if he goes traditional, and he'll get the majority, I think, if it's self-published or closer to it. So maybe he's got some, some good math there, and he's thinking, I have this audience already, and I don't need them to market me, which is what I'm paying for when they take all my money from selling my books. So
yeah, well, so they have
some.
what you want. The reason I say going hybrid is such a good idea is because they still have some resources that we don't.
Sure.
And, one, they can get you into these bookstores, so you're getting into that new customer segment of people who are going into the bookstores physically.
Yeah.
Now, I'm sure has been shrinking over the years, but it's still a thing. It's still important. It also gives you instant social credibility. Right. So then you could self-publish on your own, and you could say, well, I'm already a published author. Right. And it also helps you get into things like translations. They can publish your book in different languages in different countries. All of that's difficult. They get you into libraries much more easily than you can do it on your own. You can do it, but you've got to call up the library and say, hey, do you want my book? And they might not. So they have advantages. There's no question.
Yeah. One of them is, so I actually have an agent. I worked for a lot of time on my own fantasy, and I've trying to go the traditional route.
Okay.
Have been for a few years. And I've gotten to the stage of, wow, I got an agent. And I will say that the agent has been tremendously helpful in improving the story, as has another friend of mine who is an editor. So that, like we said before, get other people to read your stuff, but the publishing industry is set up for that.
Yes.
There are people who do this for a living, and they're very good at it. So that is one advantage, I think, of the traditional route, is you've got people there and there are people definitely still in the publishing industry who want to produce great books. It's not that everybody there their margins are shrinking and all of that, so they're under much more pressure to just go with a safe bet, like you said. But there are definitely people I know who are still there who really just want to be part of producing wonderful books. So,
well, I'm sure that most of the people in the industry feel that way.
Yeah.
I'm sure that most of the people got into the industry with that in mind. It's just that you have incentives, you have realities that force you to make decisions in a much more cutthroat business-like way. That's true of anything in the world, and it is what it is. And that same thing with writers. That's the reason why people are writing to very specific tastes and very specific genre. Because they're thinking, well, I need to sell books because I got to feed my family and pay the mortgage, and that's what the people want. Then that's what the people will get. I don't even have a problem with that. Other than it does not produce the highest quality art to think that way. You've put your mind into a box, and you're sort of, why would you put limitations on yourself? You don't want to do that. But I understand it. I totally understand it.
Yeah, I like the beauty of the self-publishing, among other things, for me, is just that freedom that you're talking about to write the story you want to write, and you're not fettered to having to write this type of fantasy and check all these boxes and that sort of thing. So I guess there are pros and cons, but it is really wonderful to hear how viable self-publishing has become as a way for somebody who's interested in writing to find an audience. So
well, and there's people who are much better at it than I am, but yes, it is absolutely a market, and there are many people, and I suggest there are many more writers now making a living writing books than at any time in human history. So that has to be a good thing.
I think so. I think so. Yeah. So that's fantastic. Did you want to talk about anything else before we move on to Kings of Paradise? We mentioned possibly talking about reviewing and booktubing and that sort of thing. Do
Yeah,
you have some
well,
questions for me?
yes, I could flip it around on you for quite a while, probably, but uh, maybe because it's so interesting to me, maybe it's just like writers. My question to writers is sort of, what happened to you? Why are you doing this? What's wrong with you? And I have the same sort of brainwave about bloggers and reviewers and YouTube, because I know it's very difficult. I
Yeah.
know how much time goes into making these videos,
Oh,
uh,
yeah.
and so I assume you've got a job, and I assume you've got family and friends, and you look like a respectable individual. So why are you doing this? Oh,
Listen, that's wonderful. So as far as being respectable, I hope so. Yeah, I mean, I do have a family. I'm a professor. I'm an English professor, and at a community college. I've been there for about 20 years. I've been teaching at the college level for about 25 years. And it's a wonderful career. And obviously, being an English professor, I'm a medievalist, actually. That's my
okay.
specialty. So Beowulf and that sort of thing.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, I'll get to that in a minute, but
We got to talk about Beowulf. Yeah.
yeah, well, maybe, I guess we can talk about the King's Paradise part, but
Yeah. Yeah. But definitely it's going to come up. So, but yeah, so I love fantasy. I've always loved fantasy since I was probably 12. I read Tolkien when I was that age. And even before that, there was Lloyd Alexander's Prydain Chronicles. That was the first one. And then there was Tolkien. So I kind of thought that I wanted to be a writer when I was about that age, 12, 13. I want to do what he did right there. That's what I want to do because that hit me so hard. And
I've, I've
so,
just I've just pieced together the rest of your life, basically,
yes, that's probably all I needed to say right there.
because it's so familiar. It's like somehow I have to be involved with this.
Yep.
That's why
Yep.
you're a professor of he's teaching English, because it. So I get it. I get you're obsessed. You're an obsessive person.
Yes, that's true. Yes, you nailed it. And even the fact that I do Old English. I mean, Tolkien was a scholar of Old English, so and Old Norse and other things. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of the path that took me to eventually to being. Because I did meet with a writer. Do you know? I don't know if they ever had you do this up in Canada, but when I was in the '80s, early '80s, when I was in eighth grade, I think it was, they had a day when they would take us all out to a different place. You would say, I want to be a police officer, or I want to be a firefighter, or I want to be a whatever. They'd take you to meet a police officer or a firefighter or what have you. I said, I want to be a writer. So in rural Vermont, they had to find a writer for me.
I'm
And
surprised they didn't just beat you to death right there.
they sure have. Would have saved a lot of trouble. So they did find a playwright, a guy by the name of David Budbill, who was a local playwright. He was very nice, and he met with me. But the first thing he said was "Hey, it's great you want to be a writer, but you probably should think about a day job." So that was like the first thing he said to me. I'll never forget it. Yeah. I mean, it makes sense, right? So my day job, which I love, has been teaching and as an English professor. And so, yeah,
So
that's how I got into
sort
it.
of one more outlet. Then you took what you were already doing, and you just sort of
Yep.
put it online.
Yep. Yep.
Got
Exactly. Exactly right. So I actually even was allowed to create a course where at the college where I teach on fantasy novels. So I've been teaching that for a few years, and I love the engagement I was getting there with my students and learning from them and just having some great dialogue. And I thought, how do I get more of this? Because because I just loved it, and B, because it's getting harder and harder to get humanities courses to run at the college level. Humanities are unfortunately under threat. So that's a different topic, though.
Yes, well,
So
and I could pick your brain about that too, but it's probably not for today. I
yeah.
was an English major. That is what I did in university.
Okay.
So I went to school here in Canada, and I eventually switched to Australia. I went to the University of Queensland,
Oh,
Gold
cool.
Coast. I thought, what's the farthest place away from where I am? And I just went there. But it was a different major. Technically, it was a writing major.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So I thought, because I was tired of learning, I always knew I wanted to be a writer for a long time.
Yeah.
And so I thought, how do I get closer to it? How do I understand how these people did this? And so I took this writing course where they would teach you how to write short stories. And because I was just
Cool.
tired of writing essays, you know what I mean? You just essay after essay. I thought, Christ, I want to write a story.
Yeah.
And it was pretty good. But the tricky thing about university is that it's often filled with professors and not writers. Do you know what I
That's
mean?
different. That's very different. Yeah.
Very different, and they are very good at teaching you about English literature or anything else. But if you are saying, how do I write it, or I had very practical questions, like, what were you thinking about when you wrote this?
Yeah.
And instead of having somebody say, well, this is what I think he was thinking about, I just wanted to ask the guy. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So yeah, when you speak to actual writers, it's a little different. It's just the doers as opposed to the teachers. You
Yeah.
get a different perspective. So I think the best education is to get both, right? You want the guys who analyze it, and you want the guys who do it. So anyway, I took probably a great deal of classes from gentlemen just like yourself, and I loved it. I've been a lifelong reader. So
Yeah.
okay, so you're an English professor. You've been doing it for 25 years. You
Yep.
teach Beowulf. You teach all that. So is that sort of like an introductory course, or do you do the?
Yeah. So because I teach at a community college, I do writing. I teach writing. I teach intro to literature, and I teach survey courses. And these include medieval to Renaissance British literature. That's my staple right there. And fantasy novels, so the course that I got to make up. So
Yeah, well, I mean, what professor you get makes such a big difference. I most of the professors I don't remember at all, and I almost majored in history because
uh-huh.
one professor whose name I still remember, you'd like it, Philip Cherrier,
Good name.
who taught East Asian history,
Aha.
and he could speak Japanese, he could speak Cantonese, and maybe a bit of Mandarin, and so he could read from these original texts. And I took the class just because I'd always been interested in history. I sit down with this guy. He starts talking about the Kwangtung Army in the Japanese conquest of most of East Asia, and he
Yeah.
tells it like a story. He hardly even introduces us or introduces us. We walk into the class. He walks us through this military conquest from the perspective of a couple of Japanese soldiers,
Yeah.
and then gives us the syllabus. And I just walked out of there enthralled, because he was a storyteller.
Yep.
And I just about switched my major right there. And I probably would have, except that history classes are so damn hard.
Yes, they are.
You know what I mean? Like, I could
Yeah.
bullshit my way through some of the English courses because I was pretty good at it.
Yeah.
But this guy, he wanted you to actually cite 15 different sources. And I thought, no, I'm too lazy for that. What are you talking? I can't possibly.
Yeah.
But yes, it's such a huge thing. And maybe we should leave the university topic alone, but when you say that you see the humanities are under, it's such a sad
Yeah.
situation. And, to me, that the humanities were always the soul of the universities. I mean, that's what they were.
Yeah. Yeah.
This notion that they're training you for a job is just kind of ridiculous. And they've been commoditized,
Yep.
and it is what it is. It's sort of like with the publishing business and
It is.
but
It is.
I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir.
Yeah, you are. I mean, there's a sort of corporatizing of academia that's taken place that is, I think the repercussions are mostly unfortunate. And it's the students who suffer the most, which to me is very upsetting, because I promise you at the very elite schools, they're still doing humanities.
Yeah.
The notion that somehow my students don't need that is offensive to me, but
Well, it's a little bit, when I talk to people about history, and literature falls into the same sort of category. I mean, they're
Yeah.
very intertwined.
Yes. Oh, yes.
And it seems to be a common attitude these days when you talk about history. If I say I'm a history buff, and I tend to go easy on this because I'm trying, it's sort of like you tell someone you're a Star Wars fan, you're like gauging how how far you can go without them thinking, oh, he's a freak or something. I just, oh yeah, I'm a history buff, you know. And then once they've reacted, then I see if I can go deeper down the rabbit hole.
Good
But for the most,
strategy. Yeah.
yeah, for the most part, people sort of think, oh well, I'm a cyclist. You know, like it's just an interest, and it's just like every other interest. And
Right.
if you don't know anything about history, that's totally fine, and you don't have to worry about it. Whereas to me, when I hear someone say I don't know anything about history, it's akin to them saying, actually, I'm illiterate.
Yeah. It's a kind of illiteracy. It is. Yeah.
Yes. And so we if someone says that to you in a casual conversation, I'm illiterate, there's sort of a social shame. It's like we'd be like, what happened? How did your education system fail you so badly
Right.
that you're illiterate?
Right.
You know, are you trying to fix that? You know, are you taking classes? Are you, you know, I'm so sorry to hear that. The reaction would be, oh, that's unbelievable.
Yep.
To me, that is my reaction when someone says they don't know anything about history. I think
Right.
if you don't know anything about, if you can't read, you know, if you're, you, what's the old quote? Maybe it's Mark Twain. The difference between a man who doesn't read and a man who can't read is essentially nothing.
Yeah.
You know, if you don't know anything about history, how can you know where you are? How can you
Right.
navigate into the future of humanity? How can you resist the many terrible forces which are always going to be plaguing you in this life, whether it's
Yeah.
politicians or you know, sleazy salesmen or whatever it is? If
Yep.
you understand the history of mankind, about, you know, currency and about the history of politics and conquest, you are fortifying yourself against all
Yep.
of the slings and arrows of life. And I just, when I hear people say that, I'm sure you feel the same way.
I do.
I think, what happened? How is this possible? We live in the most educated, richest time in the world, where we go to school for 20 years
Yep.
and people come out not knowing anything about it. How is that possible? I just,
Yep.
anyway, I'll get off my soapbox now.
It's actually, it's a good segue, because I did want to ask you about influences on Kings of Paradise, and I'm pretty sure history is a fairly important one.
Yes.
So if you don't mind, maybe we could talk about that.
Sure. Well, in some ways, it's almost embarrassing to talk to a guy like you about this a little bit, because I'm sure you can now pick apart many of the influences as you saw them in Kings of Paradise, because I've sort of talked about this before, but I have stolen a great deal from Danish culture.
Yeah.
So
Which
gods,
I approve of, by the way. I think it's fantastic. Yeah.
yes, well, we have a long-standing tradition in the genre of doing it,
Yeah.
and really just slightly changing a name, or you know, there's sometimes the theft is quite wholesale and embarrassing almost when you actually, like, if you take it and you backtrack all the way to the origins, you know, it's like, wait, you hardly made anything up, you just took it and twisted it. So there's definitely that happened.
Yeah.
Much of the Norse mythology, but actually I see this a lot in fantasy, where the Norse mythology, it's sort of a bastardized version. And
Right.
there's been I don't know how it happened exactly, but there's almost a fictional Marvel new version of Norse fantasy, you know, where you've got
Yeah.
Odin here and Thor here, and they're not even remotely like the old Odin and like the old Thor. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir again. So
Yep.
I wanted to steal more of the actual Norse mythology.
Yeah.
And so I've done some of that. And so again, the people of this world, the men of Ash, right? That is literally ripped right out of Danish lore, where they called themselves, I think it was the Askomani,
Yeah.
the men of the ash tree, or men of ash.
Right.
So I just stole that wholesale, and then I just called it, the mythology is that they erupted out of a volcano, and that's how they formed out of the ash, that all life was formed that way. So there are many things like that, which I suspect you've spotted. But it's funny, you are the first person, when I saw your review, to mention Grendel.
Yeah, that was one that just sort of, oh, I love this. And yeah, and was I correct about that?
Well, I mean, it's undoubtedly an influence, and I thought it was a bit of a giveaway in that he's raised by his mother alone in the wilderness.
Yeah.
So yes, of course, this sort of deformed, monstrous guy who's been abandoned,
Right.
and
So
so
not just Beowulf, but John Gardner's Grendel, I think, perhaps. Yes.
right,
Yeah.
yes,
Okay. Good. Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether it's a direct influence. No, but it's obviously there's an element of that.
Yeah.
I think much of these things they kind of form like a primordial ooze in your brain, and they all kind of get
Yes.
mixed together. And so when somebody says, "Did you base it on this?" One, well, no, but yes, it's part of it.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
that didn't exist, we all sort of stand on the shoulders of giants, as Isaac Newton once said.
So true.
I would be voiceless. I mean, even the language I speak, right? I mean, I'm speaking Anglo-Saxon words at half the time, right?
Yep.
Uh, and I like to give people a hard time when they talk about the English language, even if they give me grammar problems like you did. Sometimes it's just correct and there's nothing I can say.
Yeah.
It's like, yes, that is a comma splice or
Right.
but with some things, people will get upset. I don't know if you noticed this with compound words.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So I used a lot of compound words in Kings of Paradise, which I actually pulled back a bit because I got too many comments about it,
Oh.
which annoyed me because a guy like you will, of course, understand.
Oh, I love Kennings. Yeah. Yeah.
That's ripped right out of this old sort of Norse, Old English, where it's not the sea, it's the whale road. It's not.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I used a lot more of that when I first wrote Kings of Paradise and I wrote the Men of Ash, but people were confused and they, and I cried a few tears of not people not understanding the origins of that in the language, but I had to accept reality.
Yeah. Wow. That's fantastic. But you also did something I think that I haven't seen in fantasy before, which is to take that Old Norse, Old English influence and make it a matriarchal culture. I think that was a great thing you did. That was a nice twist that you brought in there. One of the things, several things you did actually to make it your own. I thought that was great. And
Good.
where did that come from? Do you just sort of decide, I think I'll make this matriarchal just to mess with things a bit?
Yeah, well, I think it comes from two places. One, I don't normally talk about, but why not? But the first is I just thought I wanted to do something with this Danish mythology that was different because it's done so many times in so many different ways that I wanted to give it a twist. So that
Okay.
was the first thought. But how I ended up giving it that twist came in two parts. One was I knew that there were matriarchies in the world and human history. There are not many, and they tend not to last too long in that form. They tend to change, but they do exist, and one still exists today, actually, which is the one that I looked at primarily, called the Minangkabau, which is a Southeast Asian culture. They were matriarchal for quite a long time, and when you say matriarchal, you sort of have to put that into context for what does that actually mean?
Right.
It means that the women are essentially the ones who own the land.
Right.
Today's cultures are so complicated and we have so many layers of civilization, but the original importance was that the women owned the land and the women were seen as sort of the figureheads.
Right.
Rather than look at the patriarch of the family, you're looking to the matriarch of the family.
They're the center of the household.
Exactly. So she might be the one who gets the final say in who the grandchild marries, and she might be the one who gets the final word in, if somebody's going to get a divorce or if there's going to be who's going to get what property or the, inheritance and so on. But human beings are pretty standard in how they organize themselves. Even if you've got the women in charge, gender roles are still very similar.
Okay.
So, even with the Minangkabau, the men are still the farmers, the men are still the warriors, the men are still, chiefs, even who are the practical sort of day-to-day owners of the world's problems.
Right.
But they are doing everything on behalf of their mother or their wife or their grandmother. And at any time, ostensibly, the mother, wife, or grandmother can step in and say, no, I want it done like this. So that is a very big difference. And to have that difference, there has to be what does the society run on? Is it power? Is it the great soldiers who are in charge? In this society, no, it is the priestesses. There's a
Aldrich order. Yeah.
exactly. There's a religious aspect to so they have the moral authority. They have,
Yeah.
don't mess with me or the God will strike you down.
Right.
And so in that culture, which is, you certainly wouldn't accuse the Danes of having too much respect for women, let's say, more than some, but still they were a traditional culture. But in this culture, they have turned that into a religious tenet.
Yeah.
So they have a holy or a religious respect for women in various aspects. Now, of course, day to day, men and women still have to live together, and you're still going to get husbands and wives who have all kinds of problems, but it results in religious punishments. Like if you hit a woman, not only is that sort of a death penalty,
right,
but it carries religious punishments that you might burn in the afterlife forever or for a certain amount of time. These people have, I give them a sort of reincarnation belief. So one of their methods to stave off the fear of death is that you'll always come back reincarnated as something else. But if you do something like murder a woman, or rape or something like that, you will be reincarnated as something terrible, and only after 100 years of burning in hell, basically. So that is a way that they have, their culture has adapted to that matriarchal view.
Interesting. Yeah.
So the other reason I wanted to do it was there's a sort of, I guess writers, maybe comedians and writers are the same. We like to poke sacred cows. We like to, any belief. And there seems to be a belief these days, and I hear this sometimes, that if women ran the world, it would be a sort of a better place and it would be different. And I've always thought that that's such a ridiculous, men are still here. It doesn't matter if women rule the world.
They'll still mess up everything.
Well,
they're in charge.
Women are going to have the same problems that men do.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So the prisons are filled with men for a reason.
Yeah.
Those men who fill the prisons and who fill the battlefields, whether you've got a woman in charge or a man in charge, you've still got to deal with those guys. And so it really doesn't change that much, was sort of what I was trying to say. What matters is how good are your ideas? How has your culture, whether it's men and women in charge, handled food production, and how is it handled dealing with minus 40-degree weather? And so hopefully that came across as me investigating it like that, as opposed to, I was really worried. I didn't want people to think I was sort of hating on women, or so that was a concern when I wrote it that way.
I'll tell you what came across to me was you had characters who were in this world, the land of Ash, who were born into these just very, very hard circumstances. And part of it is scarcity. And so scarcity produces competition, which produces a certain level of just meanness at times. But you have characters who also understand that there's a hierarchy that exists. And a lot of this stuff that's going around about the religion and everything else simply exists to protect those who already have power and to keep those who don't out in the cold. So what I thought was really beautiful, what you were doing there, was you had characters who were in places where they had difficult choices, and sometimes they do awful things as a consequence of that. They do things that are actually pretty darn awful, but you don't hate those characters because you understand these are the choices they have. These are the circumstances that have been handed to them, and a lot of it has to do with the hierarchies that have been established and are protected in the interest of the few. So it's really well done. I thought that you did a really great job with that.
Good. Well, I'm glad to hear that. It was definitely a concern as I wrote it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, and maybe this goes back to the advice for writers, if you feel that concern, you're onto something.
Yeah. You have a gut feeling about these things. Well, there's another half of this book too that we haven't even talked about yet, and I'm sure you mentioned Southeast Asia, and I feel like that the other half, the parts with Kale and his Lonnie and Tane and all the others, there's a very different, I guess, influence or inspiration behind this part of the world. This is an island place. Not necessarily. Now, I wanted to talk about the title a little bit too, because at first I thought the title Kings of Paradise, oh, this must refer to where Kale is from, Sri Khan, and maybe it does, the Pew Islands and all that. But also there are points in here where the characters are thinking about paradise as a place to get to, or a moral order they're trying to establish, or a better world they're fighting for, that sort of thing. So I think that's a nice title there. You got some good things going with that.
Yes, well, I think I commented on your review. It's sort of you're demonstrating that you get it. You know, that was definitely in my mind. So, and eventually the final title of the book is Kings of Heaven.
Yeah.
Which you know, there's very much an aspect of characters seeking a utopia, you know, and this is an incredibly human drive, right?
Yes.
Whether it's heaven or whether it's paradise on earth, whether it's, you know, whatever it is, it's an incredibly human to find that. And so I was playing on the notion that you know, this book is really about these two cultures. And in the minds of the first culture, these men of Ash, the other culture already lives in paradise. Right. In their mythology, paradise is a beautiful, warm place where the rivers never freeze, where the children don't die, you know, every winter. So that is in their mind already paradise.
Yeah.
So when they, you know, if they discover these new islands, they get there and they think it's paradise. We just have to live here. And yet there are already people who live there, and they don't think of it as paradise. They have a different type of paradise, and that, you know, imagined in there. They have an enlightened in their mythology, who sort of like a Buddha-like figure, who is preaching that they can achieve enlightenment with the right thoughts and the right. So that's another very human problem that we have to contend with. And whatever we live in, whatever reality we have, that becomes the norm. And we think of it as no big deal, even if other people might see it and think that's amazing. And again, I think I wrote it that way as a result of seeing people who live in modernity, you know, people around me always complaining about the difficulty of the world. So I very much see our culture as sort of a Pew-like culture.
Interesting.
Where we are living in a time of unbelievable plenty, where our problems compared to the problems of our ancestors are a tremendous joke, essentially. Now, that's not true of everyone in the world, obviously. There's all kinds of terrible situations. But if you are reading this book and you live in Canada or the United States or Britain, chances are things are very good. Even if your personal circumstances might be difficult in that society for whatever reason, you've got the best chance of that not being the case just by being born where you're born. So that is, I wanted to sort of juxtapose that, and I use the Pew as an example of. I should maybe mention my wife is from the Philippines.
Okay. Yeah.
And so the people, some of the superstitions I've pulled right out of Filipino culture.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yes. Oh, I almost invent nothing. And there's a reason for that, though. It's a bit George Martin-esque. I want people to realize that this is true, that people think this way, people live this way, either now or in the past. And so if you've got a complaint about some aspect of the world building in the book, well, I didn't invent it. You know what I mean?
I love it. Yeah, George Martin, I know you've talked about him, and he's a great writer, and he has done his research in history, that's for sure. And he pulls stuff from history and weaves it into his stories. And that's, hey, you know, Shakespeare didn't make up any of his plots either, you know, except for 2 of them out of all those plays. He pilfered the plots from other places. So that's what we do. You know, that's what writers do. So nothing wrong with that. It's what you make of it. And you made something, I think, really fantastic out of it. So that's really cool to hear, because I did get that vibe of sort of Southeast Asia or Asian Pacific kind of thing when we're talking about where Kale is from, Sri Khan and the Pew Islands all around it. So That's very nice, I love the, by the way, the pantheons that you created, and the fact that you didn't just dump all that on us at once. That these sort of get introduced through the course of the story. It was really well done as well.
Good. Well, that's always that's the magical balance,
Yeah.
and because you don't want to overwhelm people.
Right.
And I know I'm talking to a Malazan fan.
Yes. Yeah.
Malazan, I never know how to say that.
So, I mean, I'm not picky, first of all, so that's fine.
Okay.
But if you want to be like, it's Malazan because
Malazan.
yeah,
Oh, I never would have guessed that in 1,000 years.
yeah. So the island where it started, the empire started, is called Malaz. And so it's just the adjective form Malazan.
Gotcha.
So,
Okay. Well,
like, yeah. Yeah.
the point is, I know you're a fan of that. And
Oh,
so
yeah.
there are certain people who you can dump sort of head first into a epic series where they don't
Yes.
understand at all. I actually am not one of them. I want a little bit of hand holding. I want a bit of foreplay.
Yeah.
You know, because I just can't, you know, Gardens of the Moon just bashed me over the head. I've tried 3 times, and every time I'm thinking, am I an idiot? Am I missing something? What am I, you know? So I try not to do that. I
Yeah.
try and hold people's hands through the mythology and through the world building.
Uh-huh.
But people like what they like, and you know, it depends on where you're coming from.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I've confessed many times the first time I read Gardens of the Moon, I was doing some head scratching, you know, for sure. It is something I like to think of it as sort of a long-term love affair with this series. So,
well, I mean, as I read it, I understood that I was reading a masterwork.
yeah.
I appreciated the art. There's no question about that.
Yeah.
I would need 6 months off or something, you know, like I work with my brain all day. And by the
Yes.
time I'm finished, I'm just sort of not up for that kind of a challenge unless I'm really ready for it, you know?
Yep. Yep. Writers. And I mean, I know I think it was maybe Joe Abercrombie or somebody I heard once talk about how he doesn't read much while he's writing because your brain is tired from writing all day. That part of your brain doesn't feel like doing more, and reading, as much as we enjoy it, is still, you've got brain waves going on there. There's stuff happening. So yeah.
What I've had to do is almost give up difficult, long fantasy.
Yeah.
So I will still read history books. I will read all kinds of other difficult books.
Yeah.
But if it's fantasy, I can't stop trying to absorb. I can't stop.
Yeah.
How did he do that? Oh, I would do it. and it's just like work. And so I've lost the pleasure of it, and it's really a tragedy. But maybe one day when I'm writing something other than fantasy or something, I'll pick up the Malazan books and I'll dive back in.
Great. Yeah. Well, I've got lots of videos to help you out if that ever happens. So.
Oh, I had one more, just because we were talking about the world building and the influence. So
yes.
You mentioned Patrick Leo.
Yes.
We had a good chuckle because as he was reading this, I stole things from Indonesia. I stole from things. He lives.
Oh, yeah.
And there's a group of landowners in this culture called the Orang Kaya.
Uh-huh.
Sort of like the elite of these islands that are not necessarily noblemen, but they are sort of the rich people. Often they are nobles. Anyway, he sends me this message saying, "Hey, did you steal that from Indonesia?" Yes, I did. Because in Indonesian, I think that's the language, I'm not sure. It just means rich person.
Oh, huh.
And so I had a good chuckle because I didn't even know that. I must have known it when I stole it, or I'm not sure what I did. But anyway, he recognized that and gave me a hard time.
Oh, bless him. Yeah, that's so cool. That's fantastic. But you've done a really marvelous job creating both of these cultures, and obviously pulling from here and there to I think give it some real, just to make it feel real. It's three-dimensional, and it's great. But what I think is the heart of the stories is probably the characters, and you've got some really wonderful ones in here. I called Ruka an absolutely iconic character when I reviewed the book, and I really believe that this is just a tremendous character you've created here. So do we want to talk a little bit about them? And so my Grendel guess was sort of on the right track there with Ruka.
Yeah, well, Ruka is a fascinating character for me too. there's these characters when you're coming up with characters and you're creating even a name for a character.
Yeah.
Sometimes it can feel a little silly. You're just plucking something out of nowhere. You're just thinking, Christ, I need another name for another character, and they haven't really formed in your mind yet. And
Yep.
when I think about Ruka now, that is, he feels like a real person to me. He's
Yeah.
sometimes even when I'm jogging or something, I can hear his voice, which I assure you is not the most wonderful experience in the world. But to the someone who hasn't read the books, he's sort of an outcast. He was born deformed
Right.
into a culture which had pre-established rules about what happened when you were born deformed,
Right.
which was more or less, well, for 1,000 years, it was that you'd be essentially killed or thrown out in the cold and essentially killed. And eventually the culture had changed a little bit, and they'd come up with some laws against that. And
Yep.
but nonetheless, old habits die hard, and so the tradition was still more or less to disown you. But Ruka's mother happened to be born of a very important family,
Right.
and so the most important family in the land, in fact, which they even have a legend about. These Vishan, they call them.
Yes.
Which I can't remember the exact origin, but I assure you that's stolen from something as well.
Okay, cool.
And his mother is a very strong woman, very impressive woman. And so her family, despite wanting to disown the child, says, well, to hell with you then. I'm taking the child and I'm leaving. So that's what she does.
Yeah.
Travels.
Very courageous woman. Bela is her name. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
very impressive. And, this is in a culture and in a place where to be an outcast is essentially to be dead. I mean,
Right. Right.
you need the tribe to protect you,
Yep.
to help comfort you in the winter, and all kinds of reasons. So not only does she leave and become an outcast with an infant, she travels south, which is in this place geographically is the colder
Right.
place in the world. Think about it sort of towards Antarctica or something.
Right.
And lives more or less on her own, though that's not entirely the case. She does bring her mate along, sort of he's not part of Ruka's life, but he's
Right.
there on the outskirts providing for them. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's not part of Ruka's story, but I did that very intentionally.
Hmm.
He feels very much like a child without a father. Let's put it that way.
Right. Right. Right.
So he lives in the middle of nowhere near a small town. He's seen as an outcast and as a strange creature.
Yeah.
But he's also born with a memory, a sort of a fantasy version of a eidetic memory.
Yeah. Yeah.
So an eidetic memory is someone who can remember more or less everything that they've ever seen
Right.
or heard. There's limits to that in the real world, but I took it to the next degree. And Ruka even remembers being born,
Yeah.
even though he can't understand what's being said. When he learns to speak, he literally goes back and remembers what was said in the delivery room.
Yeah. Huh.
So very interesting character for me as well. As he grows up, it becomes something of a revenge story.
Right.
So that's where the Grendel sort of side comes in, where there's an old African expression that if you outcast the boy, the man will return and burn the village just to feel the fire.
Wow. Huh. Yeah.
I'm sure it's more articulate in the original language, but that's the gist of it. And so that's a bit like Ruka's story. If you turn a child away when he becomes a man, he's very likely to hate you and wish your destruction. And that's a very common story. It's the Joker. There's many stories like that. But Ruka's mother, as you'll see as the series goes on, tried to teach him not to be like that.
Right. Right.
She tried to teach him to survive. Her vision for him in the future is to become what they call a rune shaman.
Yeah.
Which is sort of like a religious figure in this, a male religious figure of sort of the old religion of these people.
Yeah.
So that's her path for him to make something of himself and to survive and to be able to exist in this culture.
Yeah.
Things don't necessarily work out quite that simply,
Yeah.
but I've heard some descriptions of Ruka that are sort of, I think I mentioned this on Steve's book reviews. That's, Isaac Newton meets Carl Panzram, who's a serial killer,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
Hannibal Lecter meets Conan the Barbarian.
Oh, wow. That's a good one. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So he becomes this warrior prophet,
Yeah.
who, as another character later says, this skald that ends up being attached to him. I won't necessarily say how or why.
Yeah.
That he's sort of a force of nature, you know,
Yes. Yeah.
and you don't argue with the hurricane, you just get out of the way.
Yeah.
And that becomes the sort of arc of his character, and whether he's a villain or an anti-hero or a hero, I'll leave the readers to decide that by the end of
Yeah.
the series.
I love the A meets B analogies because Ruka is a person of parts as well. And I won't say too much about that because again, we're trying not to give away too much here for the readers who haven't read it yet. But it's really, really well done. It's one of the things that makes him such a compelling and sympathetic character, are these various parts of him. And the fact that you introduce him as a relatively young character is also very important, and for building some connection in the reader with this character. So you understand him. You might not condone some of the things he does, but you understand Ruka in ways that you're still rooting for him in a certain sense. So that's really well done. Let's talk about the other side of things then. Kale, I guess in some ways, because you don't have a lot of Pacific Asian inspired fantasy out there. Superficially, at least, Kale might feel like a very different sort of fantasy story. And a lot of we haven't talked about magic at all either. And by the way, I love the way you've woven magic into this, into a very, very effectively, much more soft kind of magic. It's not like it's not the story is all about the magic, but the magic really does serve the story nicely here, particularly in the Kale where Kale is going. But Kale and his journey, I suppose, for readers who might want the more traditional boy kind of growing up and trying to figure out what's going on around him, Kale sort of meets those needs a little bit more than Ruka. I mean, he is a prince. We're not giving away too much there, but fourth son of a king, and yeah, he has some privileges, but he also has a whole heap of expectations, and the fact that his life is not his own, right? I mean, when you're a position of a royal, you don't have a lot of just personal space or privacy or freedom of choice in terms of what you're going to be and what you're going to do. So that's his conflict, I suppose.
Yes, well, I'm always fascinated by people's reactions to these characters.
Huh.
And at some point, I don't even know who came up with this. It was sort of people started saying they were either on Team Kale or Team Ruka, which almost like a Twilight thing, which is kind of horrifying in one sense, but kind of funny in another. Yes, I realized that Ruka and the Land of Ash was a very dark story.
Yeah.
So Kale's story was my attempt to lighten it a little bit.
Yeah.
Even though of course I needed the contrast and it's central to the plot, but I was trying to make his story a little bit lighter.
Yeah.
While still making it realistic in terms of how these kingdoms really worked. And
right.
So it's funny, you'll see people who think of Kale's father, who is called the Sorcerer King in these lands, and he's sort of the most important, most powerful king in the Isles. The island is even named, or the seas are named after his family. There's the North Alaku and the South Alaku Sea, and
right.
So this family is the Alaku family name. And again, most people often don't even realize that the history of humanity is not so much countries as it is kingdoms.
Right.
And rather than thinking of a place as a specific culture of people, it's more realistic to think of it as the dominate or the domain or of a kingdom.
Yes.
And so that is the case of these islands, where there are several kingdoms that rule them, but really there's only one main kingdom. and it is this family.
Right.
So Kale is the fourth son of this incredibly powerful king
Yep.
who has ruled for hundreds of years and is kind of hated by all of the other nobility for that reason.
Right.
And we get to see snapshots that things have not gone that well because, in fact, Kale's grandparents and many of his family in that generation had all been killed.
Right.
It's not clear exactly how. The story goes that they were all on a ship and that the ship basically sunk.
Huh.
So how likely is that in the history of medieval? Not so likely.
Not so much. No.
So there's probably more to that story. I'll just say that. But nonetheless, Kale's father is now the king, and he has an aunt, and he's got some brothers, and he's the fourth son, so he's not that important.
Yeah.
Other than he's part of this important family. And so we start with him in the Marines, essentially.
Yeah.
He's being toughened up, let's say, by his father.
Yeah.
But I would say he's a much more sympathetic character. He's a more normal. I tried to make him a bit more empathizable to a normal 21st century person.
Yeah, I think you succeeded there. And you mentioned the contrast. You also introduced, there's more humor in his side of the narrative, where there are certain situations that I actually laughed out loud. At certain parts, I mentioned in my review the surgical procedure, which we are not going to get into, but that was just brilliant. I mean, the way you led up to that was just perfect. That was it. I think that's going to be the scene that people are going to talk about a lot, just because it's so well done.
That does come up a lot.
Yeah, it's so funny too at the same time. But Kale has some serious stuff too, and there are characters introduced along the way like Asna and Osko, who are great side characters, great supporting characters. I mean, your main character's really only as good as some of the side characters as well. So you do a great job of introducing some of them, and you can see where with Asna particularly, there's some nice. I mean, he's a character that you immediately like and you find interesting, and I think he's going to be. I mean, comedic relief isn't quite the right way to put it, if you know what I mean. But but he's interesting. So
he is on that side of the spectrum a little bit.
Yeah.
For me, he was lovely to write. When you're writing these big epic tomes, and it's you're trying to keep the character development, which is maybe very complex and intense in some ways. When you get to write a character like Asna, there's not a lot of character development that you're looking for. Right. He's going to be pretty much what he is the whole time, and you're pretty confident that's the case as the reader. He's pretty in your face about what he is and who he is, and so he's pretty delightful to write as well. So I'm glad he's fun to read.
Yeah, he is fun. Really well done weaving those characters in there. So
now I don't know how I'm going to talk about the magic without spoilers. Or can we do a little bit of spoiler?
Yeah, as long as we warn people, we're going to do spoilers for the magic, guys, because I think you're right. It's tricky to talk about it with any specificity at all, because it happens along with the plot, and it serves the plot, particularly in this half. So spoilers, everybody, which I love the way you introduced it, by the way, with as part of Kale's training, if you will, and the way it happens very unexpectedly, because he succeeds in this trial that you're not supposed to succeed in, and he does it by meeting this mysterious young monk. And this is where it really gets, maybe you had earlier hints in there, but for me that was where it really started to get interesting in terms of the magic, which seems to be based on I don't know, I mean, there's some spiritual traditions that I'm sure you were, I'll let you talk about it, because
sure,
it's interesting to me.
Yes, well, I'm glad that you are interested in it, and I will be really interested to hear your feedback by the end of the series. Let's put it that way. But I will just discuss it in the terms of the first book.
Okay.
It's very much based on sort of a Buddhist, almost meditative, spiritual philosophy. Right. And I make some little allusions. Kale's middle name is Ratama. And when he sits, there's a point where he sits underneath this tree.
Yep.
Essentially to not achieve enlightenment, let's say, but he's finding his he really enhances these spiritual powers as he's doing that. And of course that is the myth of the Buddha, that he sits underneath what type of tree was it now, I forget. But that's where he's supposed to have achieved enlightenment, was sitting
Right.
underneath this tree for whatever 30 days and 30 nights or something ridiculous, right?
Yep.
So that is the sort of journey of this magic that Cale discovers,
Yeah.
where he goes to this island monastery. He meets this young monk who kind of hints to him that maybe the religion of your people is not necessarily correct,
Right.
or that there are other paths to find enlightenment.
Yeah.
There are other paths along the way, as he describes it.
Huh.
And so he helps Cale sort of go into this meditative state where he begins this journey of whatever you want to call it, but let's call it self-discovery or enlightenment, where he eventually begins to find these really quite powerful magic powers,
Yes.
which he can employ later on in the real world.
Yeah.
Quite devastating effect.
So it's based primarily, though, on transcendence of the self, I guess.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's very fair.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure what else to say about it, other than you obviously you haven't learned the origins. And
I'm very curious about that young monk, obviously, who's not any just ordinary young monk.
Well, that'll obviously come up again, but
yeah.
And even the island monastery that he comes from, there's some history there.
Okay.
And the connection between these two cultures is very important.
Okay. Huh.
And obviously you haven't really gone into that. No. And I've seen you, I think you mentioned it, and I think Steve mentioned at the end of the book, where there's this period where it kind of jumps, right?
Yes.
Since we're in spoiler territory, might as well cover this.
Yeah, so it's Ruka basically disappears, and then suddenly he's back, and he's like, okay, I got a place to go now. We're heading to paradise, guys. Let's go. And I figured book 2 would give us some flashbacks or something to fill in that gap. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, it's much more than a flashback.
Okay. All right.
So I'm trying to be clever, and usually that's a mistake. But you are going to see that history. You're going to see that connection, that jump in a great deal of detail, which I could not do in book 1.
Okay, that's good to hear. And I figured you would do something like that because you've hinted throughout the first book that you're willing to play around with the chronology. So that doesn't bother me at all. In fact, I like that. So I like that you introduced some complexity into it by not just starting from the beginning and going to the end. You've made some very effective use of some flashbacks and things like that. So,
well,
great.
Effective or not, it happened. So, but it's interesting when I see that. And it was really difficult to try and get that just right so that it wouldn't feel, I didn't want it to feel too rushed, and I didn't want it to feel, but I want it to be, sort of a tricky situation. Yeah. Anyway, it's very difficult to deal with that. And I don't recommend any beginning writer attempt it. Get a few books under your belt.
Don't try this at home.
Yeah, don't try this at home. That's right.
No, I have a feeling it's going to work. Sometimes you just have to trust a writer that you have learned to appreciate. So
that's it. What I was really worried about was, are people going to trust that I'm not going to do this? Like, right. I'm not going to just, skip all of that and leave you hanging.
Yeah.
And so that's what I say. It's almost better, if I was a Stephen King or something, people would be like, okay, he's going to fix this. I'm not sure what's going on. But when you're a new sort of indie writer, people think, what the hell did he do? He screwed up.
Right. Right. Yeah. Is my book, is there missing pages here or something?
Yeah.
So no, I had the feeling you were going to do that. So I'm delighted to hear that. And you've got me more interested in reading book 2 now. So that's fantastic.
People do this in different ways. They write series or trilogies or whatever, and they think of it either as stories that are sort of encapsulated, and then they move on with maybe one sort of plot arc that carries. I didn't do that. I've got several arcs that carry.
Yeah.
and they will come together
Yeah.
over time. It's
Yeah.
just, it takes a bit of time. But
Yeah. Yeah, and they've got those two main ones, but you've got some great ones. I think I'm going to be really interested to see what you do with Lonnie and with Dala and some of the other characters as well, and Egil. So yeah, I mean, it's just I'm excited for book 2. So
good. Well, it's funny with these books that are this size, when you're trying to talk about characters or plot, it's just, there's so much to it
yeah,
that it's difficult to do it. I guess I should have watched the interview with Erickson. I should see how he attempts to. I mean, I can't even imagine how he would walk through somebody the plot of. It must be insane. I mean, I don't understand
yeah,
how he would
yeah.
do it.
Well, he and his friend Ian Esselmont spent years gaming this world first. And a lot of what we read, not all, but a lot of what we read in their series, because Ian Esselmont also has written books and series in the Malazan world.
Right.
A lot of it, what we read was gamed originally. So yeah, I mean, it's just insane the levels of culture and world building that have gone into that, and the cast of characters and everything else.
Can you imagine the elevator pitch for the Malazan? You know what I mean? You've
Yeah,
got 10 seconds or maybe one sentence.
yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, forget it. Forget it. I mean, for me, I'm saying it's the greatest fantasy series of all time. There it is. There's my pitch.
Yep.
So, and I'm a lover of so many other series too. You and I are both fans of George Martin and so many others. Joe Abercrombie and Ursula Le Guin is a big one for me, and Tolkien, of course, and
Robin Hobb.
Robin Hobb. I love Robin Hobb. Yeah, N.K. Jemisin. So many others. But
Yeah, well, we have it's a good problem to have, but
yeah.
we have more fantasy or more fiction than we can possibly read.
Yep.
Not counting all of the great fiction for the past several hundred years and
Oh
beyond.
yeah. Yeah.
So,
But it must feel good that now you have contributed to this reservoir, this beautiful ocean of great stories. So I congratulate you on that, because
well,
it's a really wonderful achievement, and you've given a lot of people not just an entertaining story, but some really cool things to think about as well. So I absolutely am in awe of what you've achieved, and I thank you for the great story.
well, I appreciate that. Thanks very much. And I'm happy to chat about it whenever you like.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to chat again once I've gotten further into the next books, perhaps after book 2, perhaps after book 3, both maybe. It would be great. It's been really fantastic talking to you. Thank you, Richard.
Well, I appreciate you having me on.
All right, my pleasure.